Barr also said in his speech to a conservative college that the pandemic restrictions have gone way too far.
Putting a national lockdown, stay-at-home orders is like house arrest. Other than slavery, which was a different kind of restraint, this is the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history.
Unreal. I think one might call the systemic enslavement and torture of Black people in this country a little bit more than restraint, but let me take a crack at some civil liberties violations that might be worse than what he's talking about here with the lockdowns. Jim Crow laws, maybe, where Black people were segregated and faced mass white supremacist terrorism. How about our internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor? How about NSA spying and warrantless wiretapping? Forced sterilization of Black, Latino, and Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, the genocide of Native people in this country, habeas corpus violations and torture at Guantanamo Bay, the lynching of Black people in America, the death penalty, where we routinely kill innocent people on top of just the base barbarity. Guys, I could keep going. Slavery was about taking away every aspect of human life. It was dehumanizing. It was about enslaving people. I mean, I don't know how much more clear it can be. The lockdowns are about preserving human life, not stripping it away from people. That's a pretty important distinction when we're talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and the rights enshrined to Americans under the Constitution. And we don't even have a federal lockdown. The states are making haphazard decisions about mask mandates and lockdowns and whatever. It's just a ridiculous thing to say. It's a ridiculous thing to say, especially as he's presiding over the violations of First Amendment rights with protests throughout this country. So he was complicit and rubber-stamped, sending federal unmarked troops to brutalize and throw protesters into vans without any acknowledgement of their rights as the Attorney General. And he's talking about civil liberties violations. This is the guy that's talking about civil liberties violations. And it's because the ones I listed earlier, they didn't affect affluent white people like himself, so it doesn't matter to him. It doesn't register. It doesn't cross his radar. He's able to kind of talk about slavery in this very removed sense. But when the lockdown happens, affluent white people are like, oh, this is the worst thing that could have possibly happened to me when we're trying to save other people's lives. Get out of your own perspective. But I mean, he's just a bootlicking authoritarian. I always say that about him. He's going to take marching orders, and he doesn't consider any of the past atrocities committed by the United States government on Black, Brown, Latino, Native people as important. They don't register to him. So, meanwhile, this comes as news is breaking that he's considering other civil liberties violations on protesters. Democrats are expressing concern about Barr's increasingly aggressive stance towards protests against police violence and for racial justice that have sometimes spilled into violence. In a private call with federal prosecutors across the country this week, Barr pushed his U.S. attorneys to bring federal charges whenever they could, keeping a grip on cases even if a defendant could be tried instead in state court, according to officials with knowledge of last week's call who were not authorized to publicly discuss the matter and spoke on condition of anonymity. Federal convictions often result in longer prison sentences. During the call with U.S. attorneys, Barr raised the prospect that prosecutors could bring a number of other potential charges in unrest cases, including the rarely used sedition statute. Legal experts caution the use of that statute is unlikely given its difficulty to prove in court. This guy's talking about civil liberties as he sends federal troops on protesters and then is encouraging attorney generals to crack down on them. And by the way, these are states' rights Republicans. He wants them to bring federal charges, to be more draconian. Wouldn't you be more comfortable in Saudi Arabia, dude? Or in other authoritarian countries or theocracies where you can believe in the sky god and then also just control people's lives? Of course, human rights in Saudi Arabia, incredibly important. But it's just an example of how this is really his perspective. It's not in line with American values or the purported American values. It's very much in line with the civil liberties violations that he pretends didn't exist. There was slavery, and then everything else was good. All of the other stuff in between was perpetrated by people exactly like you, exactly with your mentality. And it's very inconvenient for him to face that reality, and he's definitely too far gone. I mean, he is the definition of a good soldier for an authoritarian who would do whatever Trump said 100%. But that's how he'll be looked at in history. He'll be looked at in the same vein as the people that committed the atrocities that I listed at the beginning, the very atrocities that he denies.